So good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending our session today on which I think we've affectionately titled Newsflash, Widespread Ethnic Bias in Science News Reporting. And we are fortunate to have the author of the paper on that we asked everyone to read ahead of this session with us today, who's Dr. David Jurgens. David and I met a few years ago at a lunch, which is always a good way to bring collaborators together, and have worked together on some work looking at suicide and using some natural language processing, which is one of the tools that David's going to kind of talk to us about today, which I, of course, had no experience using or really understanding what it was. And he's just been an excellent collaborator and teacher in helping me understand what it is that this is doing. And he's in the School of Information here at the University of Michigan. And I think oh, sorry, the last thing I'll say is sort of an organization today. He's got a few slides to kind of help us get oriented to what what happened in the paper, both like kind of methodologically and then kind of conceptually. And then we're just going to open it up for questions. And so hopefully we'll have a great conversation today to see how, the last thing I'll say is that this is sort of a two-parter with the rec. So for those of you who are part of Muckwar, remember last week we did a session, our mini session was on talking to the media. And so we thought this would be a nice pairing with this as, okay, well, how would that actually get the quantifying the importance of how we talk to the media and get our work recognized in the popular press. So David, with that, would you take it away, please?
I will continue with the Zoom tradition, try to share my screen, and we'll see whether it actually works. I think it did. Can you all see my slides?
No, we see a mountain or an island. Oh, now we see your slides.
Okay. Whew. That's a relief. Okay, so so today, super excited to talk to y'all. We're going to talk about author mentions in science. But I think maybe the better subtitle for this is how to think about text as data. I think as scientists and scholars, we all think about like data in general, but like text often seems really qualitative. So there's like that, thing at the end of the survey form where it's like, do you have any other opinions? And then it's like, oh yeah, we'll read those, but not something we might necessarily like be able to get insight from. So today, in terms of, I want to think about two studies using text as data. We'll talk about the first one, author mentions in science. But then Bree also asked me to maybe talk about more general applications. So I thought I would pull in a little bit about a study I was involved in looking at officer community member interactions in the Oakland, California Police Department, which I think also is kind of, you'd be surprised that like text really is everywhere. But I'll focus on the first one because I think it's often like a really useful grounding exercise. So this is a paper with my colleagues Hao Peng and Misha Tilitsky. Hao's a PhD student, so in keeping with the tradition of like emphasizing the first author, which you'll see like doesn't always happen as a result of this paper, it's like I'll just put Hao's picture on this one. So I actually want to kind of start with some broader framing. And that media coverage actually shapes a lot about who we think are scientists. So if you search for like physicists on Google Images, well, you get kind of like the usual suspects of physicists, and there's some variety here. But if you look kind of a little bit more closely at where these images are coming from, where Google News pulls it, all these things that I've highlighted here are news sources. And so at some point, some publisher has highlighted, here's what a physicist is, and then Google News picks this up. So like the way that the press kind of describes physics ends up sort of shaping it. And all of these are men, which is somewhat unfortunate. In terms of like who physicists are and who they could be. Of course, we know that scientific pipeline really is full of all sorts of inequitable behavior. And if we think about the leaky pipeline of science for underrepresented groups, it starts much farther back, even probably beyond high school, thinking about who ends up being like STEM faculty. And so the perceptions of who can get to that final spot, like you Google for physics and it's only white men, really shapes the, who ends up in that far pipeline to some degree. So we're actually thinking about like, let's think about who makes it into reported news. So the bigger question here is around bias in science journalism, around who's mentioned. So your publication itself is newsworthy and is actually being reported on the news. who actually gets mentioned as the scientist when you're actually in the news. Also, I should say, if you have questions, I mean, feel free to like interrupt me at any time. I think, you know, Zoom chats or Zoom is kind of like an impersonal thing. So feel free, like I don't mind interruptions. You can also do the chat thing if you want to just chat. I'm sort of used to that now from my class too. Okay, so how are we going to get at this question? There's actually quite a bit of structured data. So maybe sounds, if anybody who've looked at altmetrics, so here's a fun paper talking about gender biases in male students, which is somewhat unfortunate. But if you notice, if you've ever looked at one of these, there's some sort of impact score on the left, but then there's kind of these tabs up here of like news, blogs, Twitter, and so on. And so we can actually get data from altmetrics. They've graciously provided us like a ton of data across all sorts of different news outlets. So we get 1.7 million news stories, which is text, but there's actually a lot of metadata associated with them, like the DOI number. And we can again use the DOI number to like look up who the authors are. So we can actually get quite a bit of information on that. So the core text, we're going to use a Python library just to pull out the text that we're interested in. This is, I would say you don't have to do this either. Like you could still just look at the raw file if you wanted to. We're going to pull out the author mentions, which I'll talk about how that happens there. And we can also even get stuff on the stories too. So our big goal is to figure out which first authors get mentioned. So here, you know, Jungming has said something, and we'll actually just train a logistic regression model. So just something that predicts yes or no, does the first author get mentioned in this particular article once it makes it into the news. So here's actually like Inside Higher Ed, and Jungming has mentioned, so it's like what factors led to this, if anything. So let's kind of unpack this regression model. So we're going to have some like dependent variable for is mentioned. We're going to add some like independent variables for the authors, so trying to capture who they are as people, where they're coming from. We'll think about the article and story as another set of independent variables. So like where are you getting published, or how long is the story? And then we'll think about like the domain and topic. So deep learning, machine learning, at least in my field, is really hot right now. So, you know, it gets mentioned a lot. And so maybe that's more likely to, you know, get mentioned. I guess the thing I want to point out here is that all of these are actually like pretty standard. Like we didn't have to do any text-based analysis. Like we basically just downloaded an Excel spreadsheet and kind of can put them straight into like your favorite regression formula for like Stata or R or SPSS. I'm not sure which folks use, but we often use R for many things, but you basically just kind of plug it in. And there's really no need for doing any text analysis. Maybe the text analysis, though, comes at this point when we ask, how do we actually measure whether someone gets mentioned? So if we do that, how do we convert text features for regression? I'll say most of the time sorry, I should have put this abbreviation. This is jargon. This is natural language processing. This is like my normal field of like doing stuff with text. And we often use a programming language called Python. It's kind of like R, maybe to me, it's like a lot simpler to use. That said, there's lots and lots of libraries for trying to take like lots of unstructured, messy data and get something out of it that's like a number that you can plug into a regression somewhere. And just to give you like a sense of the code for author inclusion. So here's, I've given you a name. I said, here's my first author, Hao Peng. He managed to get mentioned in a New Scientist in an article, and we told the reporter, like, you have to mention Hao. Like, we cannot, in good conscience, not have you mention him. So you just kind of read that file in. And then really, this is kind of like the text feature. So it's like, if the name is in the story, this is literally the Python code. So even though we think about it as pretty unstructured, like there's actually, sometimes it's surprisingly easy to think about whether someone gets, mentioned as a pretty discrete test that we can do and convert like messy unstructured data to like just ones or like binary variables here. Are there any questions so far? Well, keep going. But we have a bunch of other independent variables. These mostly came from Microsoft Academic Graph. So we can take that DOI number, that unique identifier for each paper, and kind of look up stuff from this. So it's like, you know, how famous was the institution? Were they inside or outside the US? Like how many other authors were there? We can add in extra stuff like random effects for the publication venue, or like whether it's in a news outlet, like say New Scientist, which maybe covers more scientific news, that maybe they're more nuanced in how they report scientists. That said, there is a little bit of text stuff that has to happen. So none of this data comes with ethnic categories or gender categories for the scientists. I think one of the things that we can think about, even if we have this unstructured, unlabeled text, there's often many tools out there. So here we're actually going to use one from the University of Illinois. So it's called Ethnia. It's really a plug and play web interface. So we basically clicked in a bunch of stuff, and you can see that we get a bunch of different ethnicities back out. These are actually trained from basically every time you write a paper and you fill in like where you're from, they basically trained a classifier to predict where you're from like name and affiliation papers. And it works okay. Actually, it works pretty well in our manual tests. That said, there's other ways of estimating ethnicity from names. So some folks have tried to use Wikipedia as a source for this. So trying to like figure out from the name, can we predict where they were from based on their stated nationality on Wikipedia? Or if you're working primarily with US stuff, you can try to use US Census data. And actually, I want to give you an example of how this might work. And again, I'll show you a little bit of Python code, like a sprinkling of Python code, just to give you a sense of how this works. So we're going to work with what's known as a data frame here in Python. If you work in R, it's the exact same concept of a data frame, some sort of structure. I've highlighted here that it has one column called name. In this case, it's someone's last name. If you haven't worked with Python or R in data frames, you can think of this like an Excel spreadsheet or a Google sheet that you can manipulate in code. And here we have like basically just three names, Smith, Zhang, and Jackson. And we can then say, hey, infer from the census data using the name column. And what we get back is basically the percentage of persons in the US, I think this is the 2010 census, that have this particular ethnicity or racial category. I forget how the census codes it exactly, but what percent have this last name. So we can see that Smith, for example, is 73% white. 22% of people responding to the US Census have Smith as a last name and identify as Black, whereas Zhang is 98% Asian or Pacific Islander. That's this API value right here. So you can think, even though we have maybe unstructured name data, there's still a lot of meta information that we can get at actually fairly easily for trying to convert this. And there's like many, many tools. I'll touch on some at the end. So if you have kind of stuff sitting around, you're like, well, what do I do with that? It's kind of a fun way to do it. Or a useful way to convert it into something that you can use for studying human populations or behavior or disparity in outcomes. Okay, so there are three big questions.
Can I ask a question back to the other side? So in the case of Jackson, let's say, what would you do? I mean, how would you make that determination?
That's a great question. So for us, we would treat it as ambiguous. We would sort of say this name is 40% white and 53% Black. So we would actually try to code this as like a, I guess we'd say think of it as like a prior over the, or a probability distribution over the names. If yeah, I think that's not what we did in our study. We took the most likely one. Yes, I think that's what we did in the most. I should actually check with Hal to see that that's what he did. Does that answer your question?
Thanks. Yes.
I think in general, when we have it kind of like not really clear names, often, at least on the modeling side, we often try to think of it as a distribution because we don't have confidence, but there's still probably some information here that we could try to tease out. So I guess there's three questions. I'm only going to talk about one of them today, and just to give you a sense for those who haven't read the paper, because often that's me when I'm trying to get into these situations. We asked whether there's just gender ethnicity bias. We looked a little bit about does it matter who's reporting, like maybe there's dyadic interactions in terms of the reporter's ethnicity and the scientist's ethnicity. And then we looked a little bit at things getting better or trying to get some sort of prognostic, like maybe we're going to get more equitable in the future. So I guess we're going to do like a kind of a panel-wise regression. So the idea being let's not control for anything. And we're always going to compare relative to a male, and we're going to talk about a British origin name. So this, sadly, the Irish are folded into this, if anyone has Irish ancestry. So on the bottom half, we'll look at the log odds of being mentioned. So this will be a logistic regression again of whether you get mentioned in that news story. And you can think that this still kind of controls for the fact that you are being published in a news story. So your science is already newsworthy. So negative is less likely to be mentioned. And as you can see, most of the scale's already shifted left, which maybe sets a unfortunate tone, but there seems to be like pretty significant and substantial bias here. As you may have also noticed here, we do have unknown ethnicity and unknown gender here. So there are definitely names that we that we don't have a good estimate for. So in this case, we would mark these as unknown. The ethnia classifier does this for us. I would say on the gender side, this often ends up, unfortunately, being South Asian and East Asian names. Because they don't have strongly gendered markings in the names, it's just kind of very difficult to tell. For the unknown ethnicity, well, there's lots of people that aren't covered, so this kind of gets folded into there. So what happens if we add those more controls that we're still getting from the Microsoft Academic Graph and from a few other sources? So with authorship controls, so thinking about how many other authors there are, or like the institutional prestige, then we start to see a significant amount of stuff pop up. We can see that like there starts to be strong anti-Asian bias, as well as the African bias persists. If we start to add story and article controls, so the length of the story and how many other authors are mentioned in the article, we again see that the Asian bias persists, as well as the African bias. And then if we add the topic and keyword controls, so thinking about what domains people publish in, because there are significant differences in representation across science. One of the striking things here is that the gender disparity disappears when we control for topic. I don't think that is any way indicative of the fact that there's not large scale gender bias in science. I do think this is reflective of that there's a difference in focus in certain fields, and that there's difference in representation, and that certain fields are like underrepresented to begin with. They're not well presented in science. And so it disappears here. There's a much larger and richer story about gender discrimination, but we don't see it here actually. So let me just kind of summarize everything so far. So like given a non-male first author without a British origin name, so it's kind of like your stereotypical white guy, with similar intellectual status, so at a peer institution of equal rank with equal kind of H-index values, working on the same topic, so same keywords, same publication story, same number of co-authors, so not team science versus individual science, but like controlling for that, and publishing in the same venue on the same topic with its own prestige, so like we both get into PNAS or something, and whose work is mentioned in the same outlet. So this is like we're controlling for all of those things. And it's also written by journalists with a specific demographic. Sorry, I forgot that one. So controlling for all of these things, just compared to like someone who's not this person versus the male with a British origin name. If we add all of those controls in and we control for all the things, like this bias really is incredibly strong and persistent. So there's just a really strong anti-Asian, anti-African bias. It does seem that Europeanness matters too. So like the more kind of Western leaning you see, though there's sort of less bias in that regard. So if you actually kind of use what's known as the marginal effects score, so we actually try to measure relative to the probability of being mentioned. So like the average marginal effects, this is around a 36% baseline of like folks who have been mentioned. This is sort of what's the relative difference in actual percentage of probability here. So this is like around a 6 to 7% difference. So we're talking around a 20% gap in coverage. So this actually, I mean, it just basically means that like folks who come from East Asian, Chinese backgrounds and African backgrounds are 20% less likely to be mentioned than their white male peers, controlling for that whole list of stuff, which is a pretty striking thing. So everything here is significant with the exception of the gender bias. So you could ask, well, maybe it's the fact that we did something messy with our ethnicity classifier. So again, here's the result I've just shown you, where we used ethnia for doing ethnic inference. I will say that as someone who works with text data and you try to convert it into numerical stuff, you always want to do those robustness tests because you're kind of moving from qualitative to quantitative data. And it's like, maybe there's something getting lost in translation. So we tried it using Wikipedia. We again see this, like the Asian bias persists, the African bias drops off a bit. We're not really sure what's going on there, but I think it's representation in the noise. And if we do it with the US Census data, which is again not representative of the global space of science, we see the Asian bias persists again. I think that the black census data doesn't reflect the larger space of African names, and so that's why that thing shifts quite a bit. But we can see that the trend is like still very significant regardless of how we do it. So with this, I'm going to wrap up the first part of this, looking at author ethnicity, but I hope it's giving you some sense for how we can take like lots of unstructured data. Maybe we use some like lookups to get the ethnicity. So actually pretty simple libraries that move text into ethnicity and to look for names in newspapers. And we actually can find pretty robust results. Any questions before I switch topics real quick? Or
just kind of a practical, prosaic kind of question, I guess. And like, I mean, thinking about data management and how long it can take and how difficult it can be to clean up data. Like, how long did it take you to kind of get from sort of messy data to a data set that you could actually use to do this analysis?
Oh, that's a good question. Let's see. The hardest thing was probably trying to figure out how to get all the data from Microsoft Academic Graph. So this is where we have a DOI number and we need to figure out what can we get back from it. And I think that just took like a few days. I want to see that how went from like the news stories to like this result, like the initial result, and like maybe a day or two. Actually, maybe the hardest thing was just downloading the news stories, because many newspapers have paywalls these days, and trying to figure out how do we actually grab the text data. So that part was much harder. Did that answer your question?
Yes. Nope. That's good. Thanks. I just had this vision of you, like, combing through all of this text and entering all of this data, but it sounds it's a little bit more streamlined than.
Yeah, it was surprisingly streamlined. I thought when I was chatting with Hal originally, I was like, oh, this is gonna take forever. And he's like, oh yeah, I just figured out you can query Microsoft Academic Graph, and then it will like literally give you this really nice kind of Excel spreadsheet of like, here's all the stuff we know about this paper. And we're like, oh, well that solves a lot of stuff. So that sped things up quite a bit.
David.
All right, well, sorry.
Could I just ask, because maybe you're going to the next thing you wanted to talk about. So in terms of is the situation getting more equitable?
Yeah.
Well, I had some questions about that graph that I don't quite understand. But what was the time, you had studies from how long? What was the time factor that you looked at?
Yeah, so we had all the studies that were reported in the news. I want to say the time factor, I cut that slide. I want to say going back to the 50s even. Like there's some really ancient studies that occasionally get mentioned in the news. That said, most studies are mentioned like within a year or two of their publication, and we actually control for the lag between that. So if you're citing something that's like happened back in the 70s, you're probably not like likely to call up the author and ask them something about it. Does that answer your question?
But so these studies were done, or the new studies that you looked at were just done in 2020 or 2019?
Oh, I would say most of them between 2000, I would say like 80% between 2010 and 2020. So fairly recent.
Great.
Oh, I guess to some degree, that's how we were trying to measure, is the situation getting more equitable, by looking for like the change in disparity over time, like is it actually shrinking?
Right.
I didn't show this result, but it's shrinking a little bit, but not much. So it will actually take some like systematic structured change for this to become fully equitable. I don't think we realized the scope of the problem until we saw the result. Well, I'm happy to take questions too at the end. But I really want to we talked a little about news, and I want to think a little bit about another type of text data. So in this particular, we're looking at racial disparities in police language usage. So this is a lot of work with other folks at Stanford, with PIs Dan Jarowski and Jennifer Aberhart. Jennifer's this amazing social psychologist. And so the big question there was, do officers treat white community members with a greater degree of respect than Black community members? So really just focusing on this white-Black community member distinction. And so I want to sort of bring up this study just to emphasize that text data is really everywhere when you think about it. In this case, we often think about body cameras, and the Oakland Police Department has had a lot of institutional challenges in them, and as a result has been wearing body cameras for almost a decade, actually a decade at this point. And typically when we think about body camera, we think about like evidence footage. You think about going to the court or like seeing something, but these really, most police encounters do not result in that. And so they're wearing them, but it's sort of everyday behavior. So for example, here is a sanitized example of officer talking to dispatch. You could get this, you pick this up through the body camera, an occupant going in for registration, it should be a code 4. Officer says hello, the female says hello. I pulled you over because your registration has expired for almost a year. Okay, I have paperwork for it. A moving permit. I'm sorry, I have paperwork for it. Okay. So this is kind of like your routine traffic stop. And we want to say, can we actually try to look at this kind of text data to understand racial disparity in traffic stops, if it exists? So trying to make a quantifiable number from what looks like quantifiable, qualified data of just conversation data. And I think that these kinds of conversations show up in many different situations. You could think this could be doctor-patient interactions. It could be other types of conversations that you're able to study, email conversations. And so we wanted to see, can we develop a set of tools around this? So just as a first pass, we wanted to ask whether you can actually get human raters to estimate respect, because we think respect is maybe a strong proxy for something we want to measure here. So are there differences in respect for Black versus white community members? The way that this works is we actually went to the Department of Motor Vehicles. It turns out everyone has to get their vehicle registered. And so it's a great way to get a slice of life for everyone rating this stuff. And so we would show something to the citizen. The citizen says, it's in my glove compartment. So we can textualize what the officer's saying. And the officer says, let me take a look at it. How about insurance? And then we ask them to rate this on politeness or impoliteness. And in fact, we asked them several different questions trying to get at what's the notion of respect. So we asked about respectfulness, politeness, friendliness, formalness, and impartialness. And we didn't show them anything else about the race of the officer or the community member. It was just that what the community member said and then what the officer said. And we could see right away that there is a difference between the two on these 5 rating scales. They actually seem to be very, these kind of like our folk notions of respectfulness. And so we can actually kind of decompose them a little bit. So we have these kind of ratings and we can say like, we can do what's known as a principal component analysis. If you know what that is, that kind of tries to say like, what are the main ways that they vary? And we definitely find that like people are either picking up on respect or formality. That kind of captures most of what we're looking for. So if we try to plot on just these two things, we see that really there is a strong difference between respectfulness in just the data that we looked at, just as annotated data of respect. It does not look like the officers differ in their formality in the way in which they talk to community members. So the next steps we thought about, well, how do we scale this up? Because we really only had this on like 414 officers, and it was only that small set of labeled things that we took to the DMV. So what about the remaining like 35,000 interactions that we had? And that's only 1 month of traffic stops. So we wanted to be able to automate this. And this is really where I think the text analysis side of things can come into play. This is a bit more involved than say what we did in the first study, but I still think it's something that if you kind of think that this is possible, I mean, hopefully I'm showing you it's possible, it may open up a new set of questions that you might be able to answer. And also, we're going to control for lots of context here. So the study 2 was trying to understand how do we model respect with computational linguistics. So there's a lot of linguistic theory from linguistics with the capital L, like those folks that sit in, I forget what the hall is here, that talks about respect and social distance. So we're going to take some human label data that we got from the DMV and train a machine learning classifier. That said, when you think about what's machine learning, it often sounds very foreign. Machine learning in this context is literally linear regression, if you know what that what that looks like is basically from a bunch of features, can we predict the numeric value of the respectfulness of this particular interaction? And just to give you a sense of what this looks like, here's the linear regression coefficients for whether particular things were perceived as more. On the left, it's going to be whether they're perceived as more respectful or not. On the right, we're going to show you whether they were used more commonly in black versus white stops. So for example, asking is like, oh, let me get that for you. So asking for an example, or like asking permission, we can see that this is used far less likely in black stops. Talking about safety, so like, please be safe, go on safe, have a safe day. Also viewed as respectful, much more common in white stops. Looking at sort of negative model of coefficients, so things that based on what human annotators looked at when we trained the linear regression, we see that like saying, hey dude, hey man, these kind of informal titles, disrespectful, often much more likely to be used in black stops. So you can actually kind of, to give you just a few examples from text. So here I've colored the different features that we're trying to code for. They're all labeled at the top. And this is sort of on the right-hand side, you can see the predicted score of how respectful we viewed it as. You can see that, like, in this case, the more peach colored ones are viewed as negative. The blue ones are considered more positive. So it's like, you know, first name, can I see your driver's license again? So an asking for questions, using a negative word. Here, looking again at the second example, we can see there's an informal title. This is a particular one of hands on the wheel. Can you keep your hands on the wheel for me? Just crazy stuff. And here you can see, like, you know, reassurance on the last example. So no problem. Thank you very much, sir. So using formal language is perceived as more respectful. So we train a machine learning classifier. We kind of coded some features. We can get these scores. And now we can actually look at racial disparity across the entire data set. So do we have the study one, which is just on a small sample of the data? Does that hold across the entire stuff, even when we control for lots of contextual factors? So you can think about like where they're stopped, the time of day, the race of the officer, their age, what they were stopped for. So here's the key takeaway here is that if you look at the race, the regression coefficient, the DV here is the respectfulness. And we see that there is controlling for lots and lots of stuff, like whether they were arrested or whether a search occurred, that really being of the white race, that results in a higher level of respect. It's not that they are disrespectful to Black community members. It's that they are less respectful. So looking at, there's a less a disparity there. So for example, the white community members are 50%, 57% more likely to hear some of the most respectful utterances, whereas in the least respectful category, the 10% least respectful, we get Black community members hearing, are 61% more likely to hear those. So pretty stark quantifiable evidence that we can take this quantifiable data for and make it, you know, here's the really like numeric values. So this holds considering like that these are like only for everyday interactions. So when we control for like, what if we toss out all the cases where people got arrested or searched, the crime rate of the particular area, the density of the businesses in the area. So you can think about how busy it might be, whether officers are rushed, whether the driver's race was known before the stop, officer years of experience. You might ask, well, does it vary by the race of the officer? It turns out that it does not vary. There's even when there's homophilous effects for like white-white interactions or black-black interactions, does not seem to vary. And even if you can look across the interaction too, so if you measure the respectfulness of each utterance throughout the interaction, here normalized across to like 0, 1 from the beginning or end, that disparity shows up right from the start. And even though like respect kind of gets more respectful, it doesn't sort of, there's not some sort of gap where we start at the same level and then one goes south. It's really just right from the beginning. So I think this is one of the, hopefully an example of where you have, that qualitative data that shows up. I will say this, one of the highlights for me was the outcomes. So there's a nice report that basically shows this is a real phenomena. It's not just perceived, that provides specific strategies, because we could sort of back it out to the text to say, here's where you can actually improve the language. There's actually a lot of cooperation with the Oakland Police Department. And so this is actually a great picture of Jennifer Averhart, one of the PIs, talking with the police officer about like the outcomes for this. So this actually led to sort of concrete actionable items that could be improved. So I think that's one of the benefits of text data is that once you can kind of go back and forth, you can really see where there are actionable insights to be made. So I just wanted to wrap up. It's longer than Bree wanted me to talk, but to think about like text it really is data that you can leverage, and there's lots of different ways you can quantify this stuff. So you can think about readability or grade level. So if you're working with doctors, are they providing explanations that are accessible to the most educated or to like an average grade level? We have things like politeness, respect, supportiveness, intimacy, empathy. There's all sorts of ways that we can kind of take text and you get back out some score. And once you have that score, you can sort of plug that in either as a dependent variable that you want to study, maybe looking for disparity, or as something to look at maybe an independent variable that you can use to study whether people comprehended or understood some sort of interaction. We have things like positivity and negativity. You can control for topics, and these can all be learned or can do it otherwise. And that said, there's many other kinds of things that you can extract. So for example, in the study with Bree, we were able to learn a new kind of way of taking qualitative text to look for examples of mentions of long-term care in the text. So if there's something you're interested in, it can often be recovered if you figure out how to look for it in the right way. That said, I've been talking for a while, so thank you so much. This is work out of Michigan at the School of Information. My lab name is the Blab Lab Lab. Feel free to email me anytime. So happy to take many more questions now too.
Thank you so much, David. That was excellent. Thank you. So I want to, I have a couple questions for David, but I want to see if there's questions from the audience first. Or I can kick us off. David, you want to stop sharing your screen? Just
yeah, that's way better than I can see everyone.
Yeah. So my I'll ask my question. So Jennifer posted, did you look at race by gender exam in the media study, the first study?
We didn't. We looked. I don't think we actually looked for interaction effects between the two. Mm-hmm. I think that would actually be. That's a nice control to have. I don't think we have.
Yeah. But that's a nice lead in. So I wanted to ask a question, which I told you about. Oh, what is it? What do you mean categories, Jennifer? Sorry. Sorry. Do you mean, sorry, Jennifer, I don't understand your question. Oh, the interaction. Oh, you mean stratified, like within women of color, exactly. Is that?
Oh, no.
Is that what you mean?
We didn't look for that.
Oh, she's got her Bluetooth. Okay, gotcha. Yes. Okay, that's what she's asking about.
Yeah, no, we didn't look for that. I'll say didn't look for that yet. The study is still like under review, so there's always time to add that. Yeah, I don't think. Yeah, nope. Yeah, we should really look at that.
Well, and I think it's interesting with this. I mean, this I love this first paper. I was telling David last night. I was like, I found this paper, and I basically signed it for here, and I was like, hopefully we can get David to talk about it because I just thought it was so cool. But I think it's to the actionable bit of it. You know, where would that? You know, some of this would kind of come. You know, now you're getting this 10,000 foot view, and then either institutions can look at how their press offices, for example, are handling things, or you know, if we can kind of partner with other like professional development opportunities to kind of help people understand, like, this is what you need to do in order to make sure your name is mentioned, and this is why it's important. And even talking to like journalism schools, like, you know, how do you report on this? And so I wanted to ask a question, which, and I know this is where this is going because we talked about last night, but you know, I wanted to know sort of how to the move. You talked a lot about how you did this manual training for respect in the, you know, in terms of for the second study. For the first one, you used this word bias in the title, and I know I agree that's what you're studying, but I know that you've had pushback from reviewers on that term, right? So they don't want you to use that word. They think that you're going beyond that. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your sort of why you feel confident that you're able to infer intent from this kind of data when it exists, not for the purpose of measuring the intent of the reporter, you know.
Yeah, I mean, we have really gone back and forth on this one as well. I'm not sure if we actually are going to try to argue that we're studying intent to some degree. Like, I feel like you have to do some sort of causal analysis there. Like even in the second study, we were very clear that like there's disparity, but we do not call it bias in the sense because I feel like intent is like something we don't know, that we don't have a theory of mind for what these people are doing. Like, is it unintentional? Is it intentional? I mean, we talk about bias in the first paper, I think because we tried to pin it down so strictly that like there's a bias. We're not saying who is biased or whether it's implicit or explicit. Definitely seemed like reviewers wanted more disparity language than bias language.
And we were talking last night, like what this reminded me of is whether these are like, and I'm, I know as you're working, continuing to work on this, like, is this like an implicit association test type thing where we use to kind of measure things that people either can't or won't tell us about? Or similarly with our the behavioral economists who talk about like revealed versus stated preferences, and how, in an experiment you can get somebody to act in a way like they may tell you they want X, but then you put them in a situation and they behave in a manner that's different than X. And so
yeah, we thought so one of the ways that I didn't talk about this in the presentation, there's stuff in the paper. We looked at like your press office to say like, well, the press office has you in the best interest, so like they'll definitely mention you. And lo and behold, the same bias shows up there. It's a little bit less of an effect, but like it's still there. It's like, okay. We're like, well, oh, but science journalists, maybe it's just mainstream journalists. Science journalists are dedicated to covering science. They will have less bias. Same strong bias there, even stronger than the press office, about as same as the popular news. And we're like, oh my gosh, like it's so consistent across 3 very different settings of journalists. And so I think that's when we thought it was like strong enough to talk about, like there's some bias here on the part of the journalist. Like we're trying to come up with alternative explanations that might explain this, but we couldn't find one. We wanted to find one.
Yeah. I think, I mean, I know you're in the process of the revision, and I obviously you'll make the decision as to whether you want to, defend that hill of bias, but I think it's completely legitimate, and I think that's what you've demonstrated. So it was interesting to me I thought that you had seen where anyway, I thought you were well positioned with that, but of course I'm not reviewing your paper. So other questions for David, either about kind of the data science or the work? Oh, sorry, that's my garage.
Wait, how do I? Yeah. Hey, Joe.
Hi, if I just have, I'm going to ask an anthropologist question here. So I'm involved with an online self-harm research project, and someone has just this week suggested using natural language processing. So this is very timely, and I'm very excited. But one of the things I'm wondering about is, do we need to, or does this approach account for connotational value in language, or does it only focus on the denotation? So if you say, give me every reference to a word, say boy, do we lose out on things like local vernacular and just get a count, or is there a way of approaching that connotational aspect of language as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was just thinking of like, I saw a funny example. It was like, someone's like, oh, can you give me an example of where pragmatics matters? And the answer was yes. And it's like, well, that's not what you're asking. You're asking for something way better. So there's so much baked into language that we take for granted. I think for us, it ended up working because in the second study, we got data that was very much in the domain. So it was like police officers talking. So any sort of connotational value that people could read into was sort of captured in their ratings. I would say in general, some of the more advanced models can do this, but it's always a trade-off. And I think that's why we ended up having to look a lot at the data to make sure that we weren't capturing something really, really kooky. Maybe that is one of the challenges. Like the more that you go into this sort of connotational aspect, like people use metaphors, or they use like non-standard language, or like, I guess one of the big things that we've been thinking about is if you use like African American vernacular English versus other dialects of English, does the model still work as well? So there was a really good study looking at court reporters in, I think, Philadelphia, and that their transcriptions were like had significantly higher errors for Black speakers. There was another study at MPNS that was looking at like your phone for Alexa and Siri, and they often struggle with folks who use African American vernacular English, which is like a linguistic dialect of English. It's formal examples. So I think whether models are able to recognize this, I think you actually have to test it if it's in your data.
Thank you. Yeah, and what goes into, like, how would you test it? Would you pre-create a model? Would you limit it to population size or population demographics?
Yeah, I guess you make sure that whatever you train that model on is representative of the people you want to apply it to.
Right.
So, for example, the people who were working on Siri did not have like people for speaking a wide variety of dialects, especially in the U.S., and so that really limited it to probably like white male speech. It's really unfortunate.
Right. Thank you.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
It's, I guess, partly related to data science, and partly, I guess, it's targeted to other people who dealt with press and press releases, or in science journalism in general. So from what I remember from your article, you said the press releases, there's very few bias, right? Among the different ethnic categories, very little bias.
The magnitude is lower, but the rate of bias is still consistent. Like there's anti-Asian and anti-African bias.
Okay. So, and I remember from what you were saying, like a lot of news outlets just pick up the university's press releases, but then there's other issues. So for people who are going back and forth with the journalist, if you notice that your name is being removed from the article, have you all experienced any tension with like advocating for yourself to like, hey, say my name, or you just accepted it? Because I know you were saying there's some, or at least in the article, there's some tension or perceived tension about what they think their perceived audience may or may not react favorably to, and that's part of the masking. So I guess with people who've dealt with this, have you, if you saw a draft of the article and you didn't see your name, was it an issue for you bringing it up with a journalist to put your name in there?
I mean, what I would do is I would ask to, if you could, I would ask to see a copy of it. I often ask that with journalists that I talk to. I ask to see a copy of the paper, and they will almost always say yes. And then if that was a situation, I would probably send them David's paper and be like, hey, you may not be aware of this, but if there was any pushback, I mean, I guess that hasn't occurred to me, but I do usually ask to see a copy of it. I literally think we should get this paper, especially once it's gone through peer review, in the hands of all of our institutions' press office, and just be like, this is, and get it to the School of Journalism, at U of M and MSU and Wayne State, to kind of say, look, this is something that you should be talking to your students about when they go out, or even kind of understanding how they approach that. Are they aware?
Yeah, it just struck me that I wasn't sure how much of an active versus passive process this was. If the journalist is doing all the writing, and I'm sure most people are interested in seeing the article before it's released. And so is it just like people are just kind of signing off on it and no one's like bringing objection? I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, so the limited number of times someone's actually interviewed me, I don't think I've actually seen it before it has gone out. And even like there was one case where we did an internal press release. It was a paper on like caste bias in India that they only quoted me, the white male last author, and not the two Indian middle authors. And thankfully someone else in the press office caught it and was like, you should, like, what are you doing? Like, this can't go out. So I don't know where these institutional checks come in. Like, maybe it's hopefully in the middle, but I'll give you one example. So that the paper that I just saw on, or how to react to it potentially, the paper that I mentioned on racial bias in like these speech assistants like Siri and Alexa, the first author, Alison Koenigke, was not mentioned in this large study. Only they cited like the 7 male authors and not the woman first author. And so she ended up like writing a piece about how she was not mentioned and how this like leads to like constant erasure, which then got picked up in the news. I don't know if that's the way to go for all of them, but it definitely seems like it's a real, yeah, it does happen. I think you do have to advocate somewhere for it. I don't know where.
I agree. Like, I was just trying to figure out like how much agency the actual journal authors had, the study authors had, and what was written about them. So I just wasn't sure. I'm sure the passivity of it is like still a major problem because it's like structural and it's like baked into systems. But like to the extent that authors have a say in what's being said about them, I just was curious. Thank you.
So I experienced this a lot in grad school, not as much since I've been a faculty member. My grad school advisor is very famous. And when I had first authored papers, people naturally went to him and he would be the one to say, hey, no, you should interview her. This is her paper. And so he was the one that kind of did that, but absolutely they went to him first.
I think what I'm hearing in terms of professional development is, you know, we can work with our press offices about educating them about this. And then now that we've been educated ourselves, we can hopefully be more confident when we do say, no, I really need to see that. And like, I really want to make sure that my work is being represented, or that my team's work, as you become more senior, to Alicia's point, that my team's work is being represented. And this isn't Sheldon Cohen's got another paper out. No, this is Dr. Radlisha Sneed has a new paper out. And how do we recognize that? Other comments or questions for David?
Could you spell Allison's last name?
Koenece or EKE? Oh, geez.
Actually, one of our Muckware scientists is doing a project on older African Americans' use of Google Health and how it hears, you know, how often it mishears what they say.
Right.
So I thought that would be useful for.
Yes, thank you for the recommendation. Yeah, about writing in the conversation and other such outlets. I actually got a colleague of mine connected me with a journalist who is looking for scientists to write op-eds, and I connected them to Radlisha recently about, did Anna reach out to you, Radlisha?
Yes, she did.
Oh, perfect. You know, to specifically as this person who's interested in health inequities. And so they reached out to me, wanted me to do something on older adults in long-term care. And anyway, so part of it is also, I think, partnering with journalists who have our interests in mind. I've also had a good relationship with some journalists at Kaiser Health News over the last year who happened to be interested in the topic I was working on, suicide and long-term care. But they were doing a much broader thing, and I was one piece of their puzzle. But we've kept in touch throughout that time, so that's been a surprisingly rewarding kind of relationship to have.
I wonder if anybody has had connections with this. So the GSA has the journalist fellows. I can't remember what exactly it's called, but so for at that conference, there's journalists that are fellows sponsored by GSA, who network with faculty and scientists.
We should follow up with Peter about that, because with his leadership role in GSA, because that would be another great group of people that we could connect, both send this paper and then even have conversations about highlighting the work.
I was thinking follow up, even kind of a follow-up seminar, like a group discussion with them.
That's a great idea. Yeah, I agree. All right, well, we are at 11 o'clock. Thank you so much for this fantastic presentation, David. I just, that it hit as predicted. As you know, David is at the School of Information here at University of Michigan, so you can find him there. If you have any trouble, just send me a note and I'm happy to connect you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'd
Thank
love
you,
to talk to
everybody,
anyone
for
about this
coming
stuff. So it's
Yes.
you're
Yeah,
doing great work.
thanks.
So.
You're an excellent presenter. Thank you so much, David. All right, everybody. We'll see you soon. All right.
Bye.
Bye.